Chapter 5. Maya Karanom looked from her furnished room through cracked shutters at the building across the street. A barber college. The building at 49 Sage Avenue, Mars City, was a barber college. That surprised her. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. A hospital, perhaps, or even a kindergarten. But a barber college? But the source of the information she had received, that 49 Sage Avenue was the address she sought, was unimpeachable. She had ferreted it out, after a long time and through devious ways, and she was sure she could trust it. "The Childress Barber College," read the neatly lettered sign above the door. Maya's landlady, moon-faced Mrs. Chan, had pointed out Oxivane Childress to her as he left the building one day. A big man, comfortably stomached, with a heavy brown beard, which, even at that distance, she could see was shot with grey. As innocent as you please. Childress came out and went in. The students went in and came out. Still, it was the address she had been given. Maya had to gain entrance to the building. She could learn nothing from watching it from outside. She was established here as a tourist from Earth. Besides, the position and activities of women were prescribed rigidly by Martian colonial convention, and women did not study to become barbers on Mars. She would have to have help. She thought at once of Newell, and as immediately rejected him. "Maya, I don't see why you insist on working alone," he had complained. "I can set the whole machinery of government in motion to help you, whenever you need it." "Primarily because you're well known and your activities are observed," she had answered. "Your whole government machinery hasn't been effective in tracking down the rebel headquarters yet, and it's reasonable to assume that the rebels have a fairly effective intelligence network. My job is to find that headquarters, and if I were seen very often with you or tried to utilize your government machinery, they'd have me pinpointed pretty soon." She left the window, filled a tiny basin with precious water, shrugged out of her negligee, and sponged her small, perfect body. She donned form-fitting tunic, briefs, and short skirt, pulled on knee-length socks, and laced up Martian walking shoes. She spent some time preparing her hair and face. Then she left the room and the house and walked uptown. The walk was about a kilometer, along sidewalks bordered by cubical, functional houses and trim lawns of terrestrial grass and small trees. Above the city, its dome was opalescent in the morning sun. The small houses gave way to larger business buildings, also cubical, and the lawns dwindled and vanished. Farther down, the buildings were even larger and the streets were wider and busier. But she was not going into the heart of Mars City. She turned into an office building and studied the directory in the lobby. The offices were those of doctors and lawyers. On the directory she found Charlworth Syon, attorney at law, room 207. There was no elevator. Maya walked up the stairs and down a corridor, finding a door that had nothing on it but the number. She turned the knob and went in. The small outer office was uninhabited. It was carpeted and desked, with 2 straight chairs against a wall for clients. Through a door she could see part of the inner office, cluttered and stacked with papers and books. She stood there, hesitating. The outer door clicked shut behind her. At the sound, a gray-haired, preoccupied man with spectacles and stooped shoulders peered from the inner office. "Oh," he said, "I'm sorry. My secretary went to lunch a bit early today. Can I help you, miss?" "I'm looking for Mr. Syon," she said. "I'm Charlworth Syon." "Terra outshines the sun," said Maya. Syon's eyes were suddenly wary behind the spectacles. "Well, well," he murmured. "Come in, please." She went into the cluttered inner office, and Syon closed and locked the door. "And you are—" said Syon behind the desk, his pale hands fumbling aimlessly with papers. "Maya Karanom," she said. Syon found a paper and scanned it. He apparently found her name there. "I'm surprised to see you here," he admitted.
Our information was that you would be working entirely alone."
"I am," said Maya. "Or I was. I was told not to contact you unless I had to, Mr. Cyan, but it seems I'm going to need some help." Cyan inclined his head, but said nothing. "As you may or may not know, my specific assignment is to locate the nerve center of rebellious activity," said Maya. "It seems that the rebels have an intelligence network about as effective as the government's, and it was felt that a woman tourist from Earth might be successful where any unusual probing by local agents might arouse suspicion."
"That's true," conceded Cyan. "I doubt that they're really sure of the identity of more than a few of our agents, but sometimes I think they have a card file on every person on Mars. We have to be very careful that movements of our agents are consistent with their pretended occupations."
"I have a reliable tip that their nerve center is the Childress Barber College here," she said. "I can't find out anything, though, unless I get into the building over a period of time. As a woman, I can't very well apply to study barbering."
"No," said Cyan. "I see your problem."
He turned to a filing cabinet, unlocked it, and searched through it, whistling tunelessly. He found a folder, pulled it out, and studied it.
"If it is, they've certainly kept it well covered," he said. "There's not a mark of suspicion entered against the Childress Barber College. But here's a possibility for getting you in. The Barber College employs one secretary, female. Now, if you could take her place—"
Maya smiled. "I might as well apply as a barber student," she said. "You propose to remove a trusted member of their own group from their midst and replace her with a complete unknown?"
"We don't know that she's a rebel," answered Cyan. "If she isn't, she can be lured away to another job at a much better salary. If she is, and can't be lured, well, there are other methods. The Mars City Employment Agency is operated by one of our agents, and you'll be the only secretary available when the Barber College asks for a woman to fill her place. Believe me, Miss Kara Nome, as easy as it is for a woman to get married on Mars, it is difficult to find women to do any sort of business work. It won't seem at all strange that you're the only one available."
"The only trouble is that I'm known in the neighborhood as a tourist from Earth," objected Maya.
"Well," said Cyan, "things have been more expensive than you planned for on Mars. You've run short of money. You have to work for a while to pay living expenses here until the next ship leaves for Earth."
"My account at the bank?"
"It will vanish quietly from the records," said Cyan with a smile. "The bank is a government institution."
"Very well," said Maya, taking her purse from his desk. "Let me know when I'm to apply."
"You won't hear from me again," said Cyan, shaking his head. "The employment agency will notify you to appear at the Barber College for an interview."
Maya knew of Cyan only as her emergency contact on Mars. She did not know what position he held in that underground network of terrestrial agents, which was largely unknown even to Newell Ely, the government prosecutor. But whatever his position, he got things done in a hurry. Within 2 weeks, Maya was typing up applications, examination reports, and supply orders in the Childress Barber College, joking and flirting with barber students between classes, and naively declaiming to her ostensible employer, phlegmatic Oxvein Childress, how lucky it was for her that she was able to get a job right across the street from her rooming house.
"The work's easy," rumbled Childress, explaining her tasks to her. "Any time you want to take a coffee break with any of the young men, or go uptown shopping, go ahead, as long as the work gets done. Just one thing, you have to stay up here in the front of the building, and don't ever go back in the classrooms. The instructors are mighty strict about that, and that's one rule I won't stand to be violated."
This significant restriction convinced Maya she was on the right track, but she needed to move cautiously if she was not to arouse immediate suspicion. So she adhered strictly to her role for nearly a month, keeping her eyes open. If it was a rebel operation, it was almost perfectly disguised. Childress performed the duties of the administrative head of the barber college, and nothing more. The students, about 50 of them, went in and out at regular school hours, and she became casually acquainted with a good many of them. The half-dozen instructors, whom she also came to know, were less regular in their movements, but she could detect nothing suspicious about them. "We cut the hair of Mars," was the college's motto, and she learned that it was the larger of only 2 barber colleges on the planet. Apparently, it actually did supply graduate barbers to all the dome cities. It took in customers for the students to practice on, and, although many of them were strangers, some of them were prominent Mars City citizens whom she knew by sight. There was no question about it. Partially, at least, it was a legitimate barber college, whatever other activities it might mask. The only thing noticeably unusual on the surface was that it was extremely selective in its approval of students who applied for courses in barbering. She discerned that through her processing of the applications. If she was going to find out anything definite, she would have to get into the forbidden rear portion of the building. But obviously, there were legitimate classrooms there, in addition to the activity she suspected, and if she were caught nosing around the classrooms, she would be discharged at once for violation of the rules, without finding out what she sought. She would have to hit it right the first time. Biding her time and watching, she was able to learn, almost intuitively, from the movements of students, customers, and instructors, that the classrooms in which barbering was actually taught were all concentrated on the western side of the building. If there were any more sinister activities, they occurred on the opposite side. Having determined this, she planned her course of action. Near the end of her first month at work, she chose her time one day when Childress was downtown, leaving her alone in the business office. The afternoon classes were in full swing. Taking along a filled-out order form as an excuse, Maya walked quickly down the corridor that stretched across the front of the building. Carefully and quietly, she pushed open the door at the extreme end of the corridor, a little surprised, as a matter of fact, to find it unlocked. She was in another corridor that struck straight back to the rear of the building. She hesitated. There were doors spaced all along both sides of this corridor. Did she dare attempt to open one, on the chance that the room behind it was unoccupied? Then she saw that one door, a little way down, stood half open. Quietly, she walked down the hall, not quite to the door, but near enough to it to be able to see a large area of the room behind it. There were people in there. In the part she was able to see, there were half a dozen students seated, and one of the instructors standing among them. Fortunately, their backs were to her. Whatever they were studying, it was not barbering. There was an occasional murmur of voices, but she could not make out the words. Then she saw. On the table at the front of the room, which the students faced, there was a big barber's basin. As she watched, the basin slowly raised off the table and moved upward a few inches. No one was near it, but it floated there, quivering and tilting a little in the air. And then from it, slowly, the water itself came up in a weird fountain, moved completely free of the basin, and hung above it in the air, gradually assuming the form of a globe. Telekinesis. This was a class in telekinesis. The students were concentrating on the basin and water, and lifting them into the air by the power of their minds. This was indeed the heart of the rebel movement. She had found what she sought. "Aren't you where you shouldn't be, young lady?" asked a calm, masculine voice behind her. Shocked, terrified, she whirled. A tall, handsome, dark-haired man she had never seen before was standing there, observing her quizzically. His pale eyes seemed to look through her and beyond her. She forced herself to casual composure. "I don't believe I've met you," she said. "Are you one of the instructors?" "I'm Dark Kensington, one of the supervisors," he replied. "And you're Miss Kara Nome, the secretary, who shouldn't be back here." Had he noticed that she saw the telekinetic action? She glanced back at the classroom. The basin was now comfortably ensconced back on the table, full of water. "I had this order, which I thought was of an emergency nature," she said, offering it to him. "Mr. Childress wasn't in, and I thought I'd better find one of the instructors so it could be approved and go out right away." Dark took it and glanced at it. "I doubt that its emergency nature is as grave as you may have thought," he said soberly. "However, Mr. Childress would be better qualified to judge that. You understand that I shall have to report this infraction of the rules to him." Suddenly, Maya was overwhelmed by an utterly terrifying sensation. It seemed that these pale blue eyes were looking into her mind, searching, seeking to determine her thoughts and her true intention. Instinctively, not knowing how she did it, she veiled her thoughts with a psychic barrier. And, instinctively, she recognized that he detected the barrier and could not penetrate it. Telepathy? Why not, if they were experimenting successfully with telekinesis? "I'm sorry," she murmured hurriedly, and brushed past him. He did not try to detain her. She hurried back to the office. She hurried, but as she hurried down first the one corridor and then the other, she discovered that her steps were slowing involuntarily. A powerful force seemed to be detaining her, attempting to draw her back. Frightened, but curious, she attempted to analyze this force even as she struggled against it. She could not be sure, it was disturbing either way, but she could not be sure whether it was a telepathic thing or merely the magnetic force of this man's powerful masculine personality that pulled at her. In a state of mental turmoil, she reached the office. Childress was not yet back. Should she wait for him? Then, as suddenly as she had sensed Dark Kensington's telepathic probing, she sensed something else. Somewhere, in the back of the building, he was talking to another man she had not seen before, and within 10 minutes Dark Kensington would be in this office. And the prospect she faced was far more serious than mere discharge for infringement of company rules. She had to get in touch with Newell at once. She recognized that if she could get out of this building and across the street to her rooming house, she would be safe for a little while. She could telephone Newell from there. Grabbing her purse, she hastened out of the office. 6. The 3 men who stood by a table in the back lobby of the Childress Barber College and checked off the departure of the men at regularly spaced intervals were as different in appearance as they were in their positions in the Order of the Phoenix. Oxvane Childress, big and bearded, was the front, and directed the very necessary task of administering the Childress Barber College as a genuine barber college. Childress was a prominent member of 2 of Mars City's civic and social clubs, and careful examination of his activities over a period of years would have thrown no suspicion on him. The chief, whose real name perhaps Childress knew but never spoke, was a huge-headed midget who directed the far-flung activities of the Order of the Phoenix as an underground rebel organization. He never left the building, but reports were brought in to him from all over Mars. He knew a great deal at any time about what the government and MarsCorp were doing, and he gave the orders for those moves aimed at maintaining the secrecy of the Phoenix. Dark Kensington, tall and pale-eyed, had moved at once into the natural position of guiding the experimental work of the organization in extrasensory perception and telekinesis. He was able to add his knowledge of earlier work to the progress that had been made since his disappearance, and coordinated the studies in the various dome cities. A little behind the 3 stood Fancher Ladigan, doing the actual checking with a pencil on a list in his hand. "I think it's all unnecessary," rumbled Childress unhappily. "I watched the girl carefully while she was here, and the usual checks were made into her background. It's true she had some social contacts with Newell Ely when she first came to Mars, but there's nothing sinister about that association, and it seems the last thing a MarsCorp agent would do openly. As far as I could determine, she just realized she'd violated a rule and would be discharged for it, so she left before she could be discharged." "She hasn't returned to her rooming house," remarked the chief in his high, thin voice.
"Looking for another job, or maybe just on a trip," said Childress. "After all, she's a terrestrial tourist. If this is all a false alarm, how am I going to explain suspending operation of the college for a period?"
"Remodeling," replied the chief. "Work out the details, and put a sign up as soon as evacuation has progressed far enough."
"It may be unnecessary, Oxvane," said Dark, "but it's best not to take chances. This telepathy is a very uncertain thing, and sometimes it's hard to differentiate true telepathic communication from one's own hopes or fears. But it seemed to me that I had the very definite sense that Miss Karen Nome was seeking something with hostile intent, and it's entirely possible that she saw part of one of the experiments through that open door." 2 students appeared, gave their names to Fancher in an undertone, and sauntered out the back door of the building.
"What's the status now?" asked the chief.
"They were 19 and 20, answered Fancher precisely. "They're part of Group C, which is going to Hesperidum. Group A goes to Regina, Group B to Charax, Group D to Nuba, and Group E to Ismenius."
"None to Solus?" asked Childress in surprise.
"No, sir, nor to Phoenicius either," answered Fancher. "They're both so far, and Solus is a resort where they might be easier to detect. We're using both public transport and private ground cars. All of them so far have reported safely through the flower shop, except these last 2, so the government evidently hasn't thrown a ring around the building yet."
"And I don't think they will either," growled Childress. "I tell you, it's all unnecessary."
"Are things going smoothly here?" asked the chief.
"Yes, sir," replied Fancher. "The last 5 men scheduled to leave are taking care of any customers who come in, and the rest of them are packing supplies into the trucks. As soon as I get word from the flower shop that the last pair has cleared, I give another pair the word to leave."
"It seems to be moving along well," said the chief,
and he turned his green eyes upon Childress.
"Is the business office manned?"
Why, there's no one there right now," said Childress, taken aback.
"I think it would look extremely peculiar to any investigator if you weren't there, frantically trying to locate a new secretary," said the chief quietly.
Childress left in confusion. The chief turned to Dark.
"I think Fancher's handling this very well without my help," he said. "You know where your ground car is, if we all have to make a run for it?"
"Yes," answered Dark. "We won't be going together?"
"No,"
replied the chief, and his lips twisted in a faint smile.
"I have my own method of exit, which should give them other things to think about."
He left, moving with quick, short steps. Dark stayed for a few moments more, then he too went back into the building to help with packing. The Lowland Flower Shop, on the other side of Mars City, near the west airlock, was the clearance point for the evacuees. The flower shop was operated by a Phoenix agent, and each pair that left the Barber College passed through there before leaving the city, to let those behind know that they had not been stopped by government men. Other Phoenix agents watched the heliport and bus station for any evidence that the government was trying to block those routes out of Mars City. The evacuation moved steadily, and it began to appear that Childress was right. Singly, the first 2 of the 5 trucks moved out, and all of the ESP instructors and 32 of the students had reported back safe clearance from the flower shop, when Dark was moving a stack of charts from one of the classrooms to the basement when bells all over the building set up a tremendous clangor. Immediately, the quiet evacuation dissolved into an uproar, with men running and shouting and the bell ringing incessantly. Dark knew what had happened. Childress, in the front office, had seen government agents approaching, or perhaps they had actually entered the building. He had pressed the alarm bell, then sought to delay them with the righteous indignation suitable to the administrative head of a barber college, which is invaded by government officials. The bell stopped suddenly, and the scattered shouting sounded strange and thin in the comparative silence. Then the piping voice of the chief came over the loudspeakers spread throughout the building.
"Attention," said the chief. "We are temporarily safe. The alarm automatically sealed all doors to the building behind the front corridor. Kensington, please come to my office. The rest of you, tie up the customers still here and leave them unharmed, and then leave the building by the emergency exits. Scatter, and make your way by whatever private transportation method you can to the rendezvous assigned to your respective group. Do not use public transportation, because Mars Corp will undoubtedly be checking public transport now."
Dark set the charts down on the stairs and made his way back to the chief's office. The chief was sitting, tiny behind his big desk, his face as serene as ever. He was puffing casually on one of the long Hadriacum cigars. Dark laughed. "You don't have another one of those cigars, do you?" he asked. For the first time since he had been there, Dark saw the chief's mouth break into a full, broad smile.
"I think so," said the chief, an undertone of delight bubbling in his voice.
He reached into the desk and pulled one out. Dark accepted it gravely and lit it.
"The last 2 evacuees have been reported to the flower shop, and they're overdue," said the chief, his face getting serious. "Childress hasn't reported back here by telephone either, so the Mars Corp gang probably had already entered the building before he detected them and sounded the alarm."
"What about Childress?" asked Dark. "What will happen to him?"
"He'll take the rap," answered the chief. "His defense will be that if there were any Phoenix activities going on here, he didn't know about it. He was just running a barber college in good faith. I don't think they can prove otherwise."
"Do we have any idea what our situation is?" asked Dark.
"A very accurate idea. We have observers posted in the 2 houses at the ends of our emergency exits, and they've been reporting to Fancher in the next room by telephone. There's a force of about 100 Mars City policemen and plainclothes agents in the streets all around the building. They saw a squad go into the front, but evidently they didn't have enough warning to let Childress know in time."
"Will the doors hold?" The chief's mouth quirked.
"They'll need demolition equipment to break them down," he said. "All these have are heat guns and tear gas. One of the observers farther downtown said he saw a tank coming this way, but if they don't already know there are innocent customers in here, Childress will tell them."
"Then everybody gets away but Childress."
"We hope. They're not going to ignore the surrounding houses, especially with men drifting out of them and moving away. That's why I want to stress the importance of one thing to you, Kensington. You are too important for us to lose at this juncture. With your knowledge of the original work done, that house at the end of your exit will have a dozen or so of our men in it, waiting to drift away one by one. But you can't afford to worry about them. I want you to get in that ground car alone and take off like Phobos Rising."
"You're going out the other emergency exit?"
"That's none of your business. But, as a matter of fact, no. If you want to see something that will throw consternation into this Mars Corp outfit, watch the roof of this building. Now, get moving, Kensington, and good luck. Fancher and I will be leaving as soon as he gets all the records packed."
The chief held out his tiny hand, and Dark shook hands with him. Then Dark left, went down into the basement, and entered an underground door in its eastern wall. He had to crawl through the tunnel driven through the sand under the street. He emerged in the basement of a house across the street, which ostensibly was owned by Manfall Kingran, a retired space engineer. He went upstairs. About half the personnel of the Barber College, who had not been caught by the alarm, were roaming the rooms of the small house, drifting singly out the back door at 10-minute intervals. Dark went to the front window and looked across the street at the Barber College. The street was full of men carrying heat pistols, moving restlessly, facing the Barber College. Some of them were in police uniform. Squads of them moved about on the college grounds, and a few were in the yards of houses on this side of the street. Dark watched the roof. As he did so, from its center, a helicopter rose into the air, hovering over the building, moving upward slowly. So that was the chief's escape method. He had smuggled a helicopter into the domed city itself. But how was he to get out of the city in it? The appearance of the copter threw the men outside into confused excitement. They ran about, aiming their short-range heat beams futilely up at the rising copter. A military tank, undoubtedly the one the chief had been told about, spun around the corner. It stopped, and its guns swung upward toward the copter. But they remained silent. Heavy heat beams or artillery could puncture the city's protecting dome. The copter went straight up, gathering speed. Up, and it did not stop. It hit the plastic dome near its zenith. It tilted and staggered. It ripped through the dome and vanished. Immediately, sirens began to wail throughout the city. Doors clanged shut automatically everywhere. Lights and warning signs flashed at every street corner, advising citizens to run for the nearest airtight shelter. The dome was punctured. Emergency crews would be up within minutes to repair the break, and very little of the city's air would hiss away. But in the meantime, every activity in Mars City was snarled by the necessity to seek shelter. The chief had, indeed, created a situation of consternation in which it would be easier for the Phoenix men to elude their enemies. The armed men of the government forces were already running for the houses in this area. Some of them were heading for the house from which Dark watched. The Phoenix men were donning Mars suits. They would admit the refugees, after requiring them to lay down their arms, and then leave the house in their Mars suits. Dark grinned happily and walked quickly through the house to the attached garage. He climbed into the ground car, started the engine, and opened the garage door by the remote control mechanism on the dashboard. Accelerating at full power, Dark drove the ground car out of the garage and spun into the street. The men afoot, seeking entrance to the houses, paid no attention. The tank began to turn ponderously in his direction, but by the time it was in a position to bring its guns to bear, Dark's ground car had reached the corner and raced around it into the broad thoroughfare leading to Mars City's east airlock. The airlock was only a dozen blocks away. The chief's theory had been that the government, depending on surprise in its move to surround the Childress Barber College, would not attempt the complicated task of checking all traffic passing through the airlock until it was realized that some of the Phoenix men had escaped from the trap at the college. Dark reached the airlock in minutes. The chief's theory proved correct. There were no police at the airlock, and the maintenance employees stationed there did not even look up as Dark's approach activated the inner door. He drove the ground car into the airlock. The inner door closed behind him. The outer door opened, and Dark drove out onto the highway that struck straight across the Syrtis Major lowland toward the Area Desert and Edom. It was as simple as that. About 10 miles out was the circular bypass highway that surrounded Mars City, and Dark proposed to turn right on that, for his destination was Hesperidum. The highway he was on would take him eastward, and Hesperidum was about 8,000 kilometers southwest of Mars City, a little better than 2 days' drive at ground car speed on the straight, flat highways. Dark reached over and set the ground car's radio dial on the frequency which had been agreed on for emergency Phoenix broadcasts during this operation. If government monitors caught the broadcasts and jammed them, there were alternate channels chosen. With only about 24 radio stations on all Mars, plus the official aircraft and ground car band, there was plenty of free room in the air. There was nothing on the Phoenix frequency now but a little disconsolate static. The country through which he drove here was uninhabited lowland. The human life on Mars, agricultural, industrial, and commercial, was concentrated under the domes of the cities. Except for a few tiny individual domes at the edge of Mars City, there were no human structures close to it except the airport and the spaceport, and these were west and north of the city respectively. The highway struck straight and lonely through a faintly rippling sea of gray-green canal sage, spotted occasionally with the tall trunk of a canal cactus rising above it. Later, he would see infrequent dome farms, but he could expect no more than 2 or 3 score of these in the entire long drive to Hesperidum. Dark slowed and entered the cloverleaf that took him onto the bypass expressway. Even as he did so, the radio crackled, and the thin voice of the chief sounded over the ground car loudspeaker.
"Attention, Phoenix," said the chief intensely. "Attention, Phoenix. Emergency instructions. We have monitor reports that the government is checking airlocks at all cities. Repeat, the government is checking airlocks at all cities. Some Phoenix have been captured attempting to leave Mars City. Instructions. Those in Mars cities do not attempt to leave, but find shelter with Phoenix friends. Those beyond the dome without credentials go to assigned emergency rendezvous spots outside dome cities. Repeat instructions. Those—"
Swearing under his breath, Dark pulled the ground car to a stop beside the highway. It was so simple. They should have foreseen that the government would take such a step as soon as it was realized that the Phoenix men were leaving Mars City. He himself evidently had gotten through the airlock just in time. But he had been assigned no outside rendezvous. Whether it was an oversight or not, he did not know. But the only place he had been instructed to go was Hesperidum. The only Phoenix contact he knew was the South Ausonia art shop in Hesperidum, and now he could not enter the city without being captured. He had only one alternative: the Martians in the Icaria Desert, halfway around Mars. They would remember him and shelter him, and he was sure he could find the spot. He looked at his fuel gauge. The tank was full. It would not take him quite there, but he could chance refueling at Solus Lacus, some 20,000 kilometers from Mars City. He could take the highway, turning out into the desert, to go around Edom, Aram, and Ophir. He put the ground car in drive again and made a U-turn in the highway. He entered the cloverleaf and was halfway through it when he saw the copter. It was a red and white government copter, and it was descending at a shallow angle toward him from the direction of Mars City. Dark switched his radio to the official channel. "Await check. Repeat. Ground car in cloverleaf. Stop at once and await check." Dark braked the ground car to a stop. As soon as the copter grounded, he could accelerate and escape. But the copter did not ground. It hovered directly over him. Then Dark realized it was awaiting a patrol car from Mars City to check and take him in custody if necessary. Immediately, he put the ground car in drive and whipped out of the cloverleaf under full acceleration. If he could only achieve top speed, 350 kilometers an hour, the copter couldn't match it. But the copter was on his tail at once as he swerved out of the tight curve. Its gun spat fire. There was a terrific impact, and the ground car dome shattered above him. Unprotected, he felt the air explode from the ground car, from his lungs. Oxygenless death poured in through the broken dome. It all happened in an instant. Even as the dome shattered under the copter's shell, and Dark recognized the imminence of death, the ground car twisted out of control and careened from the highway. He felt it spinning over and over, and then blackness closed in around him. 7. Maya had never seen Newell in such a state of sustained rage. He strode back and forth in the private dining room of the Syrtis Major Club, near the western edge of Mars City, slapping his fist into his hand. His face usually was engaging and boyish, the wave of his dark hair setting it off handsomely, but now it was flushed like that of a petulant child, and the lock of hair hung down over his forehead. Maya, the only other person in the room, sat quietly and watched him pace. "They had plenty of time and all the information they needed," stormed Newell, "and yet they didn't get a single one of the key men. Most of the rebels slipped out easily, right under their noses." Maya watched him detachedly. This was the man she had promised to marry, and, as she had once or twice before, she was undergoing pangs of doubt. After all, she had known Newell Ely only during the few months she had been on Mars. She had fallen in love with him for his charm, his intelligence, his good-humored gentleness, but she did not like this display of temper. It was not a controlled anger, but had something of the irrational in it. "Childress was captured," she reminded him. "Childress! A figurehead! He says he didn't know about the rebel activities going on in the college, and he's so stupid I may not be able to make a case against him." Maya recognized that this element, the success of his prosecution, was a very important factor to Newell. "Are the 12 I identified the only ones captured?" asked Maya. "Yes, 12 captured, 7 killed, and every one of them small fry. The leaders undoubtedly got away in that copter. We blockaded the airlocks fast, so most of the others are probably still in the city, but we don't have any idea where to look for them." "I may be able to help in that, when I get back from my swing around the other cities," said Maya. "I don't want you to go on that jaunt, Maya," exclaimed Newell, swinging around to face her with fierce emphasis. "You said when you had found the headquarters you'd resign the service and marry me. Now you want to go all over Mars looking for rebels." "Newell, I can identify almost all of those who were at the Barber College," Maya remonstrated. "They've picked up some men at the airlocks, and others on the roads at several cities. And even Martian law won't permit you to uproot those people and send them to Mars City just on suspicion. They can't be sent here for me to identify. I'll have to go there." "We can work out some charges to get them extradited to Mars City," snapped Newell angrily. "I don't want you to go, Maya. I want you to stay here and marry me, immediately." "Aren't you being a little dictatorial, Newell?" she suggested coolly. The warning implied in her remoteness seemed to trigger a polarized reaction in Newell. The furious dark eyes melted suddenly, the stubborn anger of the face altered on the instant to a sentimental, wistful smile of appeal. "Don't be angry, Maya," he pleaded, half ruefully, half humorlessly. "It's just that I love you so much. It's just that I'm impatient for you to be my wife." Changeability is attributed to the feminine, but Maya was not able to shift her mood as facilely as her fiancé. "If I'm worth marrying, I'm worth waiting for a little longer," she said, with an edge to her voice. She was angry at Newell for acting so like a spoiled child. "I'm going to see this job finished. I'm leaving for Solus Lacus on the jetliner tonight." "Solus Lacus!" he exclaimed in astonishment. "Why, Maya, that's halfway around Mars!" "That's exactly why the rebels might be more likely to go there. In spite of the patrols, you know they haven't picked up all of the rebels who escaped Mars City by ground car. Any of them who headed for Solus Lacus will be arriving there within the next 2 or 3 days. Then I'll make a swing around and spend as much time as necessary at each of the dome cities before coming back here." The angry, stubborn expression swept across Newell's face again. "Maya, I won't—" he began, but at that moment their guests began arriving. As the judge of Mars City Superior Court and his wife entered the room, Newell cut himself off sharp and turned to greet them. His face cleared instantly, his lips curved into a delighted smile, and he welcomed them with such natural, innocent charm that one would have thought he was incapable of frowning. The presence of the guests seemed to intoxicate him with good humor, and when he had to leave in the midst of the party to drive Maya to the airport, he did not resume his argument. He merely kissed her goodbye tenderly before she boarded the plane and begged her with melting eyes to hurry back, because he would be lonely every moment she was away. So it was that Maya stretched in a reclining chair on the sun deck of the Chateau Nectaris the next afternoon, and permitted herself to be disgusted with the entire planet Mars. Maya's small, perfect body was kept minimally modest by one of those scanty Martian sunsuits. A huge straw hat, woven of dried canal sage, hid her beautiful face. A disappointing resort area for an Earthwoman, this Solus Lacus lowland. No swimming, no boating, no skiing. No water and no snow. Just a vast expanse of salty ground, blanketed with gray-green canal sage and dotted with the plastic domes of the resort chateaus. Nothing to do but hike in a Mars suit or sun oneself under a dome. She had chosen the Chateau Nectaris because it was the largest of the resort spots, and therefore the most likely one to be chosen by men who sought to hide out for a while. She had contacted the managers of all the resort chateaux, and all had agreed to let her know of the arrival of any new guests. There had been 3 of them during the morning, 2 arriving by ground car and 1 by copter, at 3 different chateaux. She had driven to each one and circumspectly inspected the new guest, but none had been anyone she recognized from the Childress Barber College. In a way, she wished she had yielded to Newell's importunities. There was much more of interest to do in Mars City, and Newell was charming and intelligent and rather dashing, and she did love him, and she did want to marry him. But she was right in wanting to help identify those rebels who had been captured before she considered her task finished, and perhaps Newell had been right in his implied disagreement with her idea of coming first to Solus Lacus, so far from Mars City. Logically, would it not be harder to lose oneself in a fashionable resort area than in a good-sized city? But something within her had urged her to come here first. It was a hunch, and she intended to play it. With a sigh, Maya pushed the hat off her face and stared with exotically slanted black eyes at the shining blur of the dome hundreds of feet above her. She sat up, hugging her knees with her arms. A score of other guests were sunning themselves here also. At her movement, the unmarried men turned their eyes on her frankly. The married ones did so furtively, to be promptly yanked back to attention by their wives. Maya's onyx eyes surveyed this dullness aloofly, then lifted over the nearby parapet and across the sparse terrestrial lawn, which would grow only under the dome. The far cliffs of the Thaumasia Felix Desert loomed darkly, distorted through the dome's sides. The dome's airlock opened to admit a ground car. She watched it interestedly as it scurried like a huge glassy bug along the curving road and disappeared under the parapet in front of the chateau. Mail from Mars City, perhaps, or supplies. Maybe even a new guest. Something struck her, now that the ground car was no longer in sight. It had been a little too far away to discern its details clearly, but there was something strange about the appearance of that ground car. A glassy bug, but not entirely sleek and shiny. Rather like a bug that had come out second best in an argument with another bug. Maya arose, purposefully. She stretched lithely, to the delight of the assembled viewers, and padded gracefully toward the chateau's second-floor entrance, trailing the huge hat in one hand. She walked lightly along the balcony over the lobby, toward her room. As she turned its corner, passing the grand stairway, she could see the chateau entrance and the registration desk. The ground car had brought a new guest. He was signing the registration book, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a Mars suit, holding his Mars helmet under his arm. Why would he be wearing a Mars suit in a ground car? As she looked, he laid down the pen and turned. His face was darkly tanned, strong, handsome. His hair was black as midnight, his eyes startlingly pale in the dark face. His gaze lifted to the balcony, and Maya ducked behind the big hat just in time. Dark Kensington. Triumph swept through her. She had been right in coming here. This was Dark Kensington, the man she had met once, just before the raid on the college. This was one of the leaders. The hat held casually to conceal her face. Maya walked on to her room. The telephone was ringing as she entered. She dropped the hat on the bed and answered it. "Miss Karen Nome, this is Quellman Grin, the manager," said the male voice on the line. "You asked me to notify you about any new guests. One has just registered." "I saw him," she said. "What can you tell me about him?" "He is registered as D. Kensington, from Hesperidum," answered Grin. "He is just staying overnight. His ground car dome was broken in an accident, and he wants to have it replaced and the ground car refueled." "Thank you," said Maya. "Now please put a call for me to S. Newell Eli in Mars City." She had bathed and dressed for dinner by the time the call came through. "Newell," she said, when he had identified himself on the other end of the line. "I knew I was right in coming here. One of the rebel leaders just registered." "Are you sure?" he asked excitedly. "Certainly I am. He was one of those who stayed hidden in the back of the Barber College, and I saw him for the first time the day of the raid. He identified himself then as a supervisor, but he's just staying overnight." "That's long enough. I'll get a jet and be up in a few hours. Get the police to take him in custody and hold him for me."
"Darling, there aren't any police at Solus Lacus," Maya reminded him. "This is a private resort area. The nearest police are at Ophir."
There was a silence while Newell digested this. "You say he's staying overnight?" Newell said then. "I can be there before midnight with some men to take him in custody." "I'm a trained agent," said Maya. "I can take him in custody for you." "You'll do no such thing," squawked Newell in alarm. "It's too dangerous. Now listen to me, Maya. You stay out of sight of this man and wait till I get there."
"All right, darling, I'll use my own judgment," replied Maya demurely, and hung up. She sat and cogitated for a time. She was dressed for dinner, and she had been looking forward to appearing in the dining-room in the somewhat sensational, molded, flame-red gown she had bought recently in Mars City. She didn't relish the idea of having dinner sent to her room, and sitting up here alone to eat it. With sudden decision she arose. She donned dark glasses and tossed a powder-red veil over her dark hair. Kensington had only seen her once and would not be expecting to see her here. If he saw her now, he wouldn't recognize her. 15 minutes later, she was sipping an extremely expensive martini in the dining room when she raised her eyes to see Dark Kensington enter, wearing a dark red, form-fitting evening suit. He paused just inside the door and stood there, slowly surveying the room. His eyes fell on Maya and paused. Then he walked straight to her table. "May I join you, Miss Kara Nome?" he asked in a deep, controlled voice, a rather sardonic smile on his lips. She felt trapped, and irrationally angry at him for recognizing her. "I'm afraid you've made a mistake," she said coldly. "That isn't my name." At this juncture, a helpful waiter appeared at Maya's elbow and asked, in an appallingly distinct tone, "Would you care for another drink, Miss Kara Nome, or do you wish to eat now?" "An understandable mistake, since it's such a common name," said Dark, sitting down opposite her. He turned pale blue eyes, remote and filled with light, on the waiter and added, "She'll have another drink, and bring me one of the same." The waiter left, and Maya removed her dark glasses to level furious black eyes at Dark. "I could call the manager and complain that you're annoying me, you know," she said. "You could," he agreed somberly. "You seem to be a very efficient tattletale. Or are you going to try to pretend that you weren't the one responsible for the raid on the college?" She recognized that she was well in for it. He was not going to play a game of pretense. Well, she had tried, partly anyway, to do as Newell wanted. Very deliberately she opened her purse, realizing that Dark was watching her closely, all his muscles tense. She took out a cigarette case and a lighter, laying them side by side on the table, and he relaxed visibly. Maya extracted a cigarette and placed it between her lips casually. She picked up the lighter and balanced it in her hand. "I assume that you're not armed, Mr. Kensington," she said. He shrugged and smiled, revealing strong white teeth. "Hardly in this suit," he replied. "I'm glad to see you've decided to recognize me." "I am," she said grimly. "Armed, I mean. This is not a cigarette lighter, but a very efficient and deadly heat gun. You're under arrest, Mr. Kensington, so I suppose you're having dinner with me, whether you like it or not. Now, do you mind being a gentleman and lighting my cigarette, since this is not very good for the purpose?" He looked at her face, then dropped his eyes to the lighter, still smiling. "You'd better take my word for it," she advised. "I don't want to kill you, Mr. Kensington, but I won't hesitate. I'm an agent of the terrestrial government." Dark shrugged again. He produced a lighter and leaned forward to light her cigarette, without a tremor. The waiter returned with their drinks,
and an announcement. "There's a telephone call for you from Mars City, Miss Karen-Nome," he said. Maya kept her eyes on Dark. "Can you bring a telephone to the table?" she asked the waiter. "Certainly, miss," he replied. He left, and returned a moment later with a telephone. He set it before her and plugged it in under the table. Juggling the lighter gun gently in one hand, Maya picked up the phone. As soon as she answered it, her eyes were assailed by Newell's agonized voice. "Maya, I can't get up there tonight," he said. "There aren't any jets here, and those idiots refuse to bring one in from Hesperidum or Cinia for me to use. I'll have to come up by ground car." Maya sat silent, stunned. It had not seemed too great a feat to her to hold Dark captive with her disguised heat gun when she was anticipating Newell's arrival within hours. But suddenly she felt like a hunter who has snared a lion in a rabbit trap. "Maya, are you there?" demanded Newell querulously. "We'll spell each other at the wheel and drive up without stopping, but it will still take 2.5 days to get there." Maya took a deep breath. "Come ahead," she said in a steady voice. "I'll have your man waiting for you when you get here." "You'll what? But I thought you said he was only staying overnight. Maya, don't you do anything rash." "I'm afraid I already have," she said, a little ruefully. "I have him under arrest right now." The noise at the other end of the line sounded like a dismayed shriek. "You little fool!" he shrilled. "I told you not to do anything like that. How can you hold a man like that for 2 days single-handed? Call in the police." "It seems to me that I already mentioned there aren't any around here," she reminded him patiently. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Newell said, with forced calm, "I'm leaving immediately. In the name of space, Maya, be careful." Maya put the telephone quietly back in its cradle and looked across the table at the tartar she had caught. Dark smiled at her easily. "So, the reinforcements you were expecting won't get here tonight after all," he remarked softly. "He didn't say that at all," she retorted, too quickly. "There's hardly any point in trying to deceive me about it, is there?" he pointed out. "I can tell a great deal from your conversation and the expression on your face, and I'd estimate that your help is going to have to come from Mars City by ground car, a trip I've just made, so I know exactly how long it takes. Do you plan for us to spend these 2 nights in your room or mine?" She looked at him silently, stricken. "I see our waiter returning," said Dark equably. "I trust you'll enjoy your meal as much as I'm going to enjoy mine, Miss Karen-Nome." 8. The waiter unplugged the telephone and lifted it from their table. "We're ready to order now," Maya said to him. "And please, ask Mr. Gren to come in here." A few moments after the waiter left, the manager came to their table. Quellman Gren was dark and thin-faced, with sleek, oily hair. "When I told you I was here in an official capacity for the government, Mr. Gren, you said you would cooperate with me in every way possible," said Maya. "Yes, Miss Karen-Nome, I have made every effort to do so," replied Gren. "Is there some way I can help you now?" "Yes, there is," she said. "This man is my prisoner, and I'm going to have to keep him in custody here for 2 days and a half, until help arrives from Mars City. I'd like for you to arm a couple of dependable men with heat guns and assign them to help me guard him." Gren shook his head. "I'm sorry, Miss Karen-Nome, but none of the employees of the Chateau Nectaris was employed for that sort of work, and I'm not going to ask them to do it. What you should have is police help. As you know very well, there are no police nearer than Ophir," she said in an exasperated tone. "Surely you have some semi-official officers employed in the chateau, in case of trouble among the guests." "I have a house detective, but his duties are to intervene only when some crime has been committed against a guest or against the chateau. You told me that you were seeking political rebels, and I assume that that is your charge against Mr. Kensington. My house detective has no authority to act in such cases, and I do not intend to get the chateau mixed up in these affairs. I've cooperated with you to the extent of giving you information you wanted, Miss Caranome, and I'll continue to cooperate insofar as I am not asked to do something I have no authority to do. It occurs to me that if you came here seeking rebels, you should have come equipped to handle them if you found them." "It occurs to me that you act very much as though you were in sympathy with the rebel cause," retorted Maya angrily. "My sympathies are not the government's affair, as long as I take no illegal actions," said Gren. "Good evening, Miss Caranome." Maya gazed after him furiously as he left the dining room. Dark, sitting completely relaxed, smiled pleasantly at her. "Please be assured," he said, "that I'm going to try to avoid injuring you in any way when I escape your custody." "I'm not worried, because you aren't going to escape," she said. "But I appreciate the thought. You seem to be a very mild-mannered person for—" She stopped. "For a rebel," he finished for her. "I really don't know what sort of indoctrination you must have had, Maya, if I may call you Maya, and there's no point in being formal under the circumstances. The students at the Barber College were all rebels, and the reports I received were that you got along nicely with most of them." "Yes, I did. I don't suppose it should surprise me to find that rebels are human beings too." "Merely a matter of difference in orientation. And a question for you to consider is, which orientation actually is correct?" Maya did not like the direction the conversation was taking. She was relieved by the appearance of the waiter with their meals of thick, steaming steaks, with all the necessary trimmings. "It will be a long time before we can be served anything like this by teleportation," she said, laughing. "But, Mr. Kensington, dark, if you don't mind." "Very well. Dark, you say that you drove here from Mars City. How did you avoid the copter patrols that were out trying to intercept the escaping rebels?" "As a matter of fact, I didn't, and that's a very peculiar thing," he said thoughtfully. "One of them got me just outside Mars City and blasted the dome of my ground car." "I noticed you were wearing a Mars suit when you registered here, and Gren said you were having the dome repaired." "That's what's peculiar about it. I wasn't wearing the Mars suit when the copter broke my dome. I didn't have any protection at all. The ground car went off the road and overturned. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but it was evidently long enough for the copter to look me over, decide I was dead, and move on out of sight. What I can't understand is why I didn't asphyxiate." "You mean that you were protected by no oxygen equipment at all?" "None. I returned to consciousness, and I was lying there in the dome broken wide open, and my face bare to the Martian air. I got into my Mars suit right away, of course, but that took a few minutes in addition to the time I was unconscious. And I didn't feel restricted by the lack of air. I wasn't even breathing. And I felt that I didn't need to." "That is peculiar," she said meditatively. "Tell me, do you know a man named Goat Hennessy?" "You're the second person who's asked me that recently," said Dark. "I knew him well many years ago, but I haven't seen him in years. Why do you ask?" "Because the only case I've heard about of any human being able to live without oxygen in the Martian atmosphere involved some genetic experiments of Goat Hennessy, before the government made him stop them and destroy the creatures he'd been experimenting with." Dark laughed. "I can assure you I'm not one of Goat's genetic experiments," he said. "Goat and I were colleagues in this rebel movement 25 years ago, before I was hit by a period of amnesia that I've just come out of." She stared at him. "A 25-year period of amnesia? Impossible. You're not more than 25 years old," she said positively. "If what people tell me is correct, I'm nearer 60, said Dark. "Terrestrial years, of course." "Of course, but I don't believe it." Dark shrugged and cut another bite of steak. He seemed to be enjoying his meal quite as much as though he were not her prisoner and she his captor, as indeed she was too. They chatted pleasantly throughout the meal, and Maya found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was talking about herself a great deal to this pale-eyed man. She told him of her childhood on Mars, among the Martians, and of going to Earth to live with her uncle, a world senator who had had close and profitable connections with Mars Corp. She went on to tell of her decision to become an agent of the terrestrial government, despite her uncle's objections, but as a result of his often expressed enthusiasm for the government's role in developing the planetary colonies, and of her assignment to Mars to ferret out a rebel headquarters, which had eluded the best efforts of the Martian government. She even told him how she had met Newell and fallen in love with him. Some time after the meal's conclusion, she suddenly stopped in mid-sentence. "What's the matter?" asked Dark. "I just realized that you are my prisoner," she answered, smiling at him. "Frankly, I'm not sure what to do with you. We can't just sit here in the dining room all night." "Why not go out and sit on the terrace?" he suggested. "They say that Solus Lacus is a beautiful sight when Phobos is up and moving. And a shadowed terrace is a very convenient place from which to attempt an escape," she countered. "Look," he said, "there's no point in making the evening more difficult than it is. I very definitely intend to get away from you and get out of here during the next 2 days if I can. But I'm enjoying this conversation. If I promise that I won't attempt an escape in the next 2 hours, are you willing to go up on the terrace for a while?" She studied his face carefully. It was a handsome, earnest face, full of strength, full of wisdom, with a touch of weariness. "All right," she said at last, "but I warn you that if my trust is misplaced and you do attempt to escape, I'll burn you down without compunction." They went up together, quite as casually as might any 2 guests relaxing at the resort, and found chairs in the semi-darkness overlooking the moonlit lowland. Deimos hung near the zenith, a tiny globe of light, virtually stationary. Phobos, larger and brighter, was not long risen, and it moved swiftly and smoothly across the sky, like the cold searchlight of some giant aircraft. Touched and transformed by the shifting shadows, Maya and Dark sat and chatted like old friends. Dark talked now, and he told her of his past life, of his coming to Mars, of his joining the rebel movement upon realizing how the government was holding back man's progress toward Martian self-sufficiency. He spoke soberly, with intense conviction, and Maya, listening, began to realize that there was another side to this conflict than the one she had been taught. She began to waver, and to wonder, for the grave voice of this man was like a deep music she had never heard before, but seemed to remember from some time before there was hearing, a music that touched the depths of her being. Then his arm slid around her waist, and he drew her gently toward him. For an instant she responded, turning her face upward. And on that instant she remembered. With a lightning twist she was free and on her feet before him. She stepped back, and the lighter gun was in her hand. "I thought you said I could trust you," she said coldly. "Evidently I was foolish to do so." He looked up at her, and there was nothing but surprise on his face. Then, slowly, he smiled at her. "It depends on your interpretation of the word," he said. "I was merely attempting to kiss you, my dear." She let her hand sag, feeling rather foolish. "Well, don't," she said, her sharpness covering her confusion. "We aren't lovers, Mr. Kensington." "No," he said, quite seriously. "And I find that I rather regret that we aren't." She stood looking at him, fighting off a sneaking regret of her own that he hadn't succeeded in his intention. "I think this moonlight has had an unfortunate effect on us both," she said. "We'd better go inside. Besides, if I'm to keep watch over you all night, I want to get into something more practical than an evening gown." Without protest, Dark preceded her inside. They went to the manager's office, and Maya issued instructions to Gren. "Have a maid move my things from my third-floor room to a room on the top floor," she ordered. "We'll wait here until it's done." When the maid brought Maya the key to the new room, she and Dark took the elevator to it. As soon as they were inside, she locked the door behind them. "I'm going into the bathroom to change clothes," she said precisely. "The window to this room is 6 floors above a stone courtyard, and I don't think you can jump that far without being killed, even on Mars. Since these windows don't open, I'll hear you if you break it to get out, and I can burn you long before you can climb down the face of the wall." The lighter gun in her hand, she went into the bathroom and closed the door behind her. She had just stripped off the evening gown when she heard the bathroom door lock from the outside. A moment later, there was the crashing sound of breaking glass. Calmly, Maya burned off the lock of the bathroom door with the little heat gun. She pushed it open and went out into the room in her underwear. Dark was in the process of gingerly climbing through the broken window. "It's a long fall, Dark," she said. He looked back over his shoulder. He smiled ruefully and came back into the room. "Well, it was worth a try," he said philosophically. He surveyed her with frankly admiring eyes and added, "And it was worth falling for the view." She turned pink, but without taking her eyes off him, she reached back into the bathroom, got the tunic and trousers she had laid out, and slipped them on. "I think it would be better if we go down and sit in the middle of the lobby," she said, unlocking the door to the room. "That way you'll have farther to run if you try to get away." They went down and found comfortable seats. They sat there, talking, to all casual appearance, 2 of the chateau's guests. Gradually, the conversation moved back to its earlier informal and friendly terms. How long they sat chatting, Maya did not know, for she was wrapped up in her enjoyment of the things Dark said and his attitude toward life. But after a time, she realized that no more guests were sitting in the lobby or moving through it. They were the only ones there, except for Gren, sitting morosely behind the registration desk. "Just how do you propose to get any sleep and watch me at the same time?" asked Dark. "I don't," she answered, smiling. "If you can stay awake for 2 nights, so can I." "You forget, young lady," he retorted. "I don't have to." With that, he stretched out unceremoniously on the sofa on which he had been sitting, clasped his hands behind his head, and closed his eyes. Within a very short time, he was obviously and genuinely sound asleep. Maya sat there and watched him, piqued and a little nonplussed. She could hardly afford to go to sleep, too. Her only course was to stay awake, to sit there and watch him sleeping comfortably and soundly. It was not a pleasant prospect for 2 nights. She sat, heavy-eyed, and racked her brain for some solution, and silently cursed Gren for refusing to give her the help she needed. Dark slept on, and a faint smile touched his lips. Then Maya found herself thinking pleasantly over the things they had talked about during the long evening, and admiring this man, and liking him. She woke up. With a start she woke up, realizing that she had been asleep. She was not sitting in the chair anymore, but curled up comfortably on a sofa, her head pillowed like a child's against what? Against Dark's chest. He was awake, sitting up, smiling down at her, and she was cradled in the curve of his arm, and the little lighter gun was no longer in her hand. She did not react violently to the sudden realization. She sighed, almost happily, and murmured to him, "So, you win after all. I think I'm glad, Dark. Now you can go if you want to." He shook his head. "I'm glad you feel that way about it, Maya, but I'm afraid it's too late. I really shouldn't have stayed around to serve as your pillow till you awoke." There was something in his face that caused her to sit up suddenly. 2 uniformed men stood there in the lobby before them, relaxed but watchful, regulation heat guns dangling from their hands. As she sat up, One of them touched his cap and spoke to her. "We're police officers from Ophir, Miss Caranome. Mr. Eli called from Mars City and directed us to drive over here and help you guard the prisoner until his arrival." She rose angrily. "I didn't ask for your help, so you may go," she said, aware of Dark's surprised gaze on her. "I made a mistake in identification." The policeman who had spoken shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "We're acting on Mr. Eli's orders, not yours. We'll have to hold Mr. Kensington until Mr. Eli arrives." She glared at them. The one who had spoken was big and burly and efficient-looking. The other was sallow and silent, with a deadly cast to his thin face. Then she saw her lighter gun, lying on the lobby floor beside the chair in which she had gone to sleep. She bent down, casually, and picked it up. She straightened, the little instrument ready in her hand. "This is not a cigarette lighter, but a heat gun," she said flatly. "I'm in charge here, and I say Mr. Kensington is to be permitted to go free. If any effort is made to stop him, I'll burn you down." Both police heat guns swung up in short arcs and trained on her. The burly policeman spoke gently. "I'm sorry, Miss Caranome, but we're under orders from Mr. Eli, and we intend to follow them," he said. "I'd hate to see you injured, but if you blast either of us, the other one will burn off your hand." "No, Maya," exclaimed Dark, getting to his feet. "Don't. There's no point in your getting hurt for my sake." She ignored him. "Drop those heat guns, both of you, or I blast!" she snapped, almost hysterically. Then Dark hurled himself bodily at the two men. The thin-faced man swung his heat gun around to meet Dark's charge. Maya twisted the lighter gun toward him, and at the same moment the burly policeman threw himself against her. Her heat beam singed the thin-faced one's shoulder, then she collapsed under the impact of the other's body. As she fell, she saw the almost invisible beam of the thin-faced policeman's heat gun strike Dark directly in the stomach, burning away the cloth, burning a great, gaping hole in his abdomen. Dark slid to the floor, writhing, gasping, clutching his stomach. Her lighter gun knocked from her hand, Maya struggled, half-dazed, to her feet. The burly policeman had swung his own gun on the prostrate Dark, but the other one, grimacing with the pain of his wounded shoulder, stopped him. "Let him be," he said. "I'd like to watch them die." With a wail, Maya dropped to Dark's side. She cradled his head against her breast and sobbed as he died in her arms.